Hi, I'm Katie, and this is the Free Art and Design School podcast, web series, whatever. I have another amazing guest here today. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, how's it going? My name's Derek. I'm from Sacramento, but I've been spending the past couple of years in the Bay Area, and I am a screen printer, mostly with risograph, but risograph and screen printing of apparel, zines, that sort of thing.
Nice. Are you one of the people who considers Rizzo screen printing?
No, Rizo's not screen printing. I mean, it's a valuable publication technique, and there's an artistic value to it, but I would not lump it in with traditional printmaking.
Okay. Ooh, interesting. Well, I mean, that brings up a great question of how did you get into screen printing? Because it is very niche.
Yeah, definitely. So my entry into it was kind of funny. When I started grad school, I was like, my hobbies kind of expanded. Like I was interested in art and like some collage and some drawing before, just very sort of unofficial, just more like doodling and that sort of thing. But when I was in grad school, I really wanted to take a pottery class actually. So yeah, I looked into it and then I like missed the sign up, or like the pottery classes in the Bay Area are like so like popular and they fill up so fast that like even checking the enrollment like the same day or within 24 hours of it opening, it was all booked. So I was like, ah damn, like I guess I'm not doing that this term. But I'd seen screen printing before. I had a friend who's an amazing actually potter and artist and screen printer out in the city. And then I had another friend that I skated with who did some screen printing at the student art studio at Cal. And so I was like, you know what? I think if I just take an art class, that'll be good. That'll satisfy the creative itch. And then I'll be in the loop for when the next pottery class opens up. And so I took an intro to screen printing class at that same studio and kind of fell down the rabbit hole, and I'm coming up on 5 years later and still an active screen printer.
Wow. That's insane to think about.
I guess other thing is the other thing to touch on with that is I did double back and take a pottery class a couple years later, and it was very therapeutic. And I was like, you know what, I'm just going to stick with screen printing. So it was kind of like I made the right choice from the get go.
That's so funny. Also for context, you didn't go to grad school for art. You're a chemist and you have so many other interests and hobbies. And I'm sort of wondering like how like your artwork is kind of insane and how like talented and precise you are at printing and at photography. Um, how do you consider yourself an artist, or is it like a different aspect of your identity? I'm sort of curious.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, as you mentioned, my grad work was doing a PhD in chemistry, which is very different. It's actually kind of funny because uh, when I do markets or things like that, people are like, "Oh, like so you're like a screen printer," and I'm like, "Oh, it's like a side job." And then they're like, "I just learned it in grad school, similar story." And then they're like, "Oh, so you did like an MFA?" And I was like, "Oh no, I did a PhD in chemistry." And they're always like, "Whoa, what the hell? Like that is wild." But obviously, like when it's your own life, you don't think it's that wild because you know all the stuff that led up to it. But yeah, I definitely consider myself an artist in terms of my background. I used to do a lot of photography and videography growing up. Had like a DSLR and would shoot a bunch of photos, and then also had some friends and I had like a brand when we were in high school, and so I was kind of like the filmer for that, and so made like all sorts of edits and full length videos, and so like really interested in like um, composing an image, and sort of like I think obviously there's a lot of overlap between film and videography. And I also really liked Photoshop, and that kind of comes from my dad does video and graphics for a living, like a lot of like
Mm.
After Effects, a lot of like video editing. And so since I was like super young, we've always had Photoshop on the computer because he worked at home. So I remember like loading it up on the old school computers, and they're
Oh my
like,
God.
it was like, oh, do you want to activate like 256-bit color, like it'll give you millions of colors. And like I remember going through all those like kind of classic like uh early internet nostalgia kind of, like all the boxes look super funky. The graphic user interface was still pretty clunky. um but yeah, so I really liked Photoshop. And what I realized is that when I got into screen printing, like this idea of thinking in layers and thinking about where you want pixels or not, especially when it comes to risograph and to some degree screen printing of more photos rather than like illustration or more analog forms of screen printing, it's almost how good are you at Photoshop more than how good are you at screen printing. So yeah, I think that really helped to kind of like sort of prime me for getting into screen printing.
Yeah, that actually I think explains a lot about some of the work I've seen from you, some of the more photographic work I have not here, but at my boyfriend's place. He's from Athens, Georgia. You had this like gorgeous Athens, Georgia like print with like the different layers that was stunning. And I was like, how on earth was this made? Do you kind of view your printmaking practice as an extension of your photographic work? Like, or is it separate, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for the longest time, I thought like I couldn't draw at all. Like I think that's a common misconception that a lot of people have. And then after reading through some books and that sort of thing, it's like I think that you can learn, just like you can learn how to screen print, you can learn how to draw. It's a skill that you develop, not like an innate ability. Granted, some people like have a good eye or they have good coordination that sort of there's people in every hobby or interest in the world where they're sort of primed to excel, I guess. So I was not one of those people, but I like to doodle and learn things about like composition and whatnot. But part of what I really liked about screen printing was I started to shoot film when I was in college and like transition from a DSLR to like a film SLR. And then it felt really funny to like get the film developed and then get a digital print. And you're kind of like, wow, I just went through this analog process. And sure, you can do the whole darkroom thing, but I didn't have access to that. Still haven't gone through the full processing route. I
You're
can
a
explain.
chemist, though. That's
Yeah.
horrible. You have to process your own
Yeah.
film.
I can talk about the method here in a second, but it's more I let someone else do the processing, and then how I actually like bring the film into the digital form is like where my process starts. At least like how it's been over the past couple of years. Um, but yeah, so printmaking was a way to like still have sort of an artisanal quality of a film image, something that came from an analog medium.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that process? Because that's like a super interesting
Yeah.
take on the digital analog
Yeah,
combo.
yeah, yeah, definitely. So traditionally, like Photoshop makes it super easy to do color separations. And for those who are not as familiar with my work, a lot of it is CMYK screen printing, which is like building up a photographic full color image from basically your three primaries, slightly modified, and then a black layer as well. So Photoshop, you can put any image in, it separates it all out. It's like how they did it before in analog times, I have no idea. It's like one of those things that I've just am like, someone figured this out, and that's wild. Um, but as I said, I shoot the film, I get it processed, and then I just get the negatives back. And then I have a flatbed scanner that I scan the film in with. And what's cool is it allows you to control like contrast and exposure and that sort of thing. You could do that to the JPEG you get back from the developer if you were to get the scans, but it's interesting to see how much information is conveyed in that analog sheet of plastic, essentially, especially coming from a digital photography background where you shoot raw images and you have all this color control. It's like crazy how much you can pull out of and sort of manipulate a photo between when it's on the negative and just over the scanning process. But yeah, so I'll scan it in, and then I digitize the film in that way, and then from that file I can put it into Photoshop. Usually I do a fairly accurate representation of the film and try and match the colors, but sometimes I'll do things like add texturing and the choice of like how you do the halftones. There's all these choices along the way and little knobs that you can turn. Something I realized because I was really into CMYK printing when I first got started. That was like within 5 or 10 prints. I was like, oh, I bet let me try and see if I can do a photo, because it was sort of a challenge for the registration. And then for years I switched to Rezo, and then this past calendar year or so, I've been like, I can't do Rezo for prints anymore. I just have to get back to screen printing. But like how big the dots are makes a big impact. And what I realized is like sometimes if you do a super high res screen print and do the CMYK process perfectly, it looks like a digital print if you do it well enough. And then I'm like, well, wait, now people don't know it's a print. So I started switching back to like a really chunky dot. And that was inspired by a screen printer at Max's Garage Press, Daphne, and she's the queen of screen printing. And
You taught me how to screen print.
Oh, really? No way.
Yeah, the only time I've ever done it.
Yeah, she's like one of my sources of learning new techniques and just like inspiration about what the medium can be.
Yeah, she's amazing. I actually met her at the Aesthetic Union. And I was just going to talk about the digital analog divide. Letterpress printing, like you used to not want to emboss or deboss the paper because it was a sign that you were a bad printer because it would build up too much ink and then newspaper would stick together. But now the only way to tell something is letterpressed instead of digital is with the deboss. And so like that whole art form changed around like the signifier of the handmade. And so it's like interesting those things that you have to put back into a physical print so that you can signify like this wasn't digital, this is made by hand. So it's really interesting to hear that like you got so close to perfection that it like looped around and now you have to like recompensate. Um, that's so interesting. Like I'm wondering, like you said you grew up with Photoshop and like understanding, you know, sort of like digital representations of media. What are some of the things that influence the like content of the work you make?
That's a good question.
Cool.
So yeah, with regards to the content of my work, a lot of it is based on photography, and then obviously that's dependent on what sort of photos I'm shooting. So I like to go out with friends a lot and go skate around like San Francisco and the Bay Area. So I've done some photo zines related to that. And then also I like to go out into the backcountry of California, like backpacking or going on like road trips with friends. And so there's a lot of that as well. And so in the city, it's more a little bit more like cityscape, but that's essentially just the other side of the coin of a landscape. The other thing that's been interesting is as part of this whole process, what I've realized is I can kind of like trick my scanner and I'll get black and white film, but then scan it in color and it gives it like a sepia kind of look. And so sometimes I'll turn that into like a 3-color print where I'll use like a yellow and red to make the orange and then use the black key layer over the top to kind of give some interesting color, like change up what would be just sort of like a flat 1-color print.
So you have a pretty like technically involved relationship with printmaking. I'm wondering if like, and maybe this is like a dumb question, but does like any of your chemistry like mind like overlap? Like are your interests in art somewhat like related to your interests in chemistry, or is it pretty unrelated?
Yeah, I think so. I think where the chemistry comes in is understanding like the color of like how the pigmentation works essentially. So, and this is something that's like when I was a monitor at Max's Garage Press helping people make prints, I'd explain this and then I'd see them go blank and it'd be like, oh, I went way too deep on that. They just want to make a print. They don't want all this information yet. But essentially, like if you're looking at a screen, you're thinking about additive color, where if you put all of your colors together, it turns white. Whereas if you're looking at print, you're thinking about how the light is going to absorb into the pigment and then what's kind of anything that's not absorbed is being reflected. And so if you have all your colors together, in a perfect world, you get a black, but really it's more of like a brown. And so it's interesting to think about like how the colors mix and like kind of thinking about like having a little bit more of a technical understanding of why pigments work. Like something that's like pretty interesting to me is like in the arts, people use these concepts and have like an understanding of how to work with it, probably better than the chemists do a lot, but may not know the underlying like reason. And the chemist may understand the reason, but not know sort of what looks good and what's like the norm. So like a good example would be like if you're thinking about different colors, their covering power can be pretty different. So like a blue is often like super, super strong and covers really well, whereas like a yellow is not. And so when it comes to mixing the colors and preparing for a CMYK, you use a process color, which is a specifically designed yellow, a specifically designed magenta and blue, where it's like, these are the agreed upon colors so that when you do a color separation, it should give you the right value. But you have to mix it with transparent base to allow the colors to mix. Because if you were just to put the magenta on top of the yellow and then the cyan on top of the magenta, you would end up with a cyan print if it was too opaque. But what's interesting is like for the yellow, you can pretty much leave it uncut and almost pure. Whereas for the blue, you have to dilute it way down, and for the black, even more to help account for that covering power.
That's super interesting. And is that, I mean, that stuff I think about is like pretty physicsy, like in terms of like, I don't know, like spectra and like how things are reflected. Is it like, I don't really know so much the difference between like Rizzo ink and like screen printing ink when it comes to the individual pigments used for like the yellow or the magenta. Like I know I did oil painting, so like I'm used to like the quinacridone magenta or whatever. But like does the individual pigment that's used in each one of these really affect it like so much? I don't know if
Yeah,
that's a clear question. That's like my poor understanding.
no, I got you. So risograph is interesting because it's like a soy-based ink, so it's a little bit more like maybe eco-friendly. Who knows? I mean, it's still a chemical that you're making, but it's probably like a little bit less toxic, and it kind of has like a natural opacity, or I'm sorry, a natural transparency to it. Some colors are a little bit more opaque, but in general, they mix really well. Whereas like in screen printing, it tends to be more of like an acrylic. And so it has a lot better covering power, and you got to like really dilute it down with a transparent base. The other sort of interesting thing with Rizo is that they don't have good process colors. So they don't have like process yellow, process magenta, process cyan. And so when you do a CMYK reproduction on a Rizo, you have to like adjust the opacity of the layers and how much ink you're actually depositing, and realize that you're working with a modified color palette. So like the channels that you split the image up into, you're not going to get cyan exactly. You're getting blue or that sort of thing. And I guess the other thing that touches is when I guess like a little bit more about like the journey of my printmaking and that sort of thing. I was doing screen printing, started to do some DIY work, and especially during the pandemic was doing some prints at home. And then I had my old art teacher say like, oh, you should like look into risograph, like if you like these multicolored prints and that sort of thing, like, and you should check out Max's Garage Press. And so she kind of turned me on to that. And risograph was really, really good for learning how color separations work and sort of getting muscle memory in terms of like, how do you break up an image and what's it going to look like? Because if you don't like it, you can just like reburn the master or like remake the master and change it on the fly. Whereas like if you're doing a multicolor screen printing process, you could change the master, but if you already have that day set aside for the studio, like unless it's really, really bad, you'll usually be like, it's part of the artisanal medium, and like justify it to yourself. And so in that way, it's like I'm really grateful for the time that I had to really spend most of the pandemic working in Max's Garage Press and working on Rizo and doing a ton of photo work, because it allowed me to like try a bunch of different images, do it really cheap, do it really fast, and learn a lot. And then now I can sort of double back and get back to the screen printing and like get back to a more traditional medium. And then even the tactile feel, like one thing I love about a CMYK print is because it's like a dried acrylic at the end and you do it on a heavy paper, it's like it's thick, it's leathery, like you can like have people touch it and like you're like, ooh, I can feel the texture. Whereas Rizo ink is more like a newsprint where like even if it's dry, even if it's been sitting there for 6 months, you touch it and it gets all over your fingers or smudges on the paper. So it's like, I don't know, just like the fact that you can kind of beat up a screen print a little bit more is nice.
Yeah. And it's also interesting what you were talking about with like being able to kind of modify a screen printing ink. Like for the most part, unless you like own the Rizzo printer, you can't really fuck with the drums too much. Like you can't change the ink. So it's an interesting like brain switch you have to do between like there's a constraint of the machine versus like a kind of, I mean, there's different constraints for the different kind of mediums that you choose to work with. So it's, I don't know, it feels like it's a lot of brain work that's required in
Yeah.
doing stuff like this. So now that you've been printing for a while, do you have a sort of philosophical outlook on like what you've learned and like how it's sort of like changed your artistic practice or maybe the kinds of photos you take? Like has your eye kind of adjusted to like different images that you're interested in because you've been a printer?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like as I kind of got into like sort of back into screen printing and back into CMYK images. The first one that I did in like probably 3 or 4 years was a print that I did for the print swap, where we got in contact, and it was the one of like the dog with the behind the fence. And
Okay.
what was funny is like the screen didn't burn right, and so it like the ink falls off, but it gives it this sort of like weird film burny sort of. I think it looks very like I guess like sort of nostalgic. Like it seems like a picture that's been, something happened during the process. Like it's super old, it's been degraded. And I really liked that. And then but that was just sort of an artifact of using a screen that was clogged. And then now I can't do that anymore. So I'm like, oh, like, do I build that in, or
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And so then recently, as I've been printing more, certain things like looking for more color, like I did a couple of these black or more like sepia type of prints. And I think they're really interesting, but unless you know about the method and that sort of thing, a lot of people are like, oh, that kind of just looks like burnt orange. And like, in terms of like sales at markets, it's like, there's a print that like I really love, but it didn't sell. And like, when you try and, post it on social media or that sort of thing, it just like the color and the dot pattern did not work with screens like on a phone. And so like I
Oh,
had a friend where I gave him the print, and he was kind of like, oh, I saw that one, like he didn't like, I could tell he didn't
yeah.
like it, but then once he saw it in person, he was like, oh, whoa, this is sick. Like, so it just goes to show like you got to see the real thing. But yeah, just getting back to like printing a little bit more sort of like color type of work. And then one of my most recent projects before I left the Bay was doing a zine, and a lot of it was these sort of sepia-like images. And so I did a Rezo zine where I actually did 2 color for every page. So that was sort of like an easier way to start transitioning into doing a full color zine, because like for those of you who haven't made a zine, nothing makes you want to take a break from making zines more than finishing one. Like by the time you get done, you're like, well, I'm so proud of this, but like, holy shit, I want to not do this for 6 months.
Oh yeah.
And so uh it was cool to slowly like add on, because like every layer of color you add is like drastically increasing the number of prints you got to throw away, and like just it cuts into your yield.
Yeah. I did for my sort of like capstone project at the letterpress shop, I did 3 letterpress scenes about printing. And I was like, this is too meta, and I think I don't want to do this again for a long time, and I have not since. But I don't know. It's really exciting to hear that like you can so easily flow between these like I mean, even though they have the same DNA, like pretty drastically different processes. Do you have like other than not wanting to do a zine right now, do you have, a kind of goal or aspiration or like some kind of cool project on the horizon that like gets you excited about printing and kind of gets you out of like the muck of like doing it?
Yeah, for sure. So it's been interesting. Before, I'm down in Mexico right now, spending a number of months in Mexico City, and I had to move out of my house in Berkeley. And so I was like wrapping up this year. I've been doing a ton of like production runs for like t-shirts. So like just doing like printing for hire and jobs. And that was really good for getting the muscle memory down, but also like sort of it's production and it's not art. So the screen printing is interesting that way, that it's like, if you're more making prints, it's more artisanal, but it is a production technique, but it can fully be commercial and not artisanal. Like the artwork is there and there's an art to how you do it, but it's like it's for a product essentially.
Yeah.
Um, and then I moved back to my dad's house for a month for the transition period because my lease was up. And so I like really wasn't printing. And then now I've been here for a couple of weeks in Mexico City, and like this is the least I've printed in like 5 years, where I'm like, whoa, that's crazy. Am I still an artist? I've like had to put a bunch of these hobbies on hold, but it's been cool because like I've had a chance to pick up like sketching and drawing. Like that's kind of, so it's interesting to see how the artistic outlets get funneled into different things as you apply these different constraints. But one of my main goals while I'm down here, because while I love making t-shirts, it's like you need a space to do it. And like as my roommate for the past 6 years. We had a t-shirt factory, as he called it, in the living room, where it was just like a rack, and I had all my prints and market stuff and blank tees, and
Oh
I'm
my
just
God.
constantly getting boxes, and the press was in the backyard, so sometimes he'd come out and like in the side yard and he couldn't even use it. Like a lot of patience on his end, so I commend him for that. But essentially, like, I have to go a little bit slower because like I can't do, especially I can't do rezo. I can maybe do some screen printing, but like I could fly home with a portfolio eventually, but I'm not going to fly home with boxes of t-shirts or hoodies or that sort of thing. And so my main artistic goal in terms of printmaking right now, I'm looking around, and I think I just found a place to do like woodcut and
Nice.
start getting into woodblock. And so for me, that's really important because it's like a slower technique. It's one that's like even a step more traditional on the sort of spectrum of printmaking techniques. And then also, Mexico has like incredible woodblock art. Like that's a very traditional form, and a lot of it's rooted in sort of like really cool like protest art and like reflections of
Yeah,
political movements and that sort of thing.
cool. You'll be using the litho stones in no time when you're back
Yeah.
in Texas.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I've seen people do litho and it seems masochistic. I have a lot of admiration for it, but like one of the other monitors at Max's was sort of like, yeah, woodblock gets to be a lot of work, and then litho gets to be a lot of work. But then if you start to do a reduction woodcut, it's like going neck and neck for what's like the most labor intensive printmaking process on the planet.
It's aspirational.
Yeah, exactly.
um Damn. I miss having a print shop. Talking to you has like been really inspiring. Also, a shout out to Christina. When I was talking to Christina, she like raised her shirt and it was
Yeah, I saw that.
yeah, and I was
I
like,
watched.
like the community is so loving and supportive and just brilliant. I feel like everyone who walks through Max's door is just inspiring and excited and like is there because they're really curious. Um
Mhm.
I'm sort of wondering if, I mean, you obviously are connected digitally, but has it been weird not having like that community around you while you're in Mexico? Is that like really strange?
Yeah, definitely. One of my, I guess, like my main contact out here in the city, and one of my best friends out here, he's actually like a Rezo publisher. So it's been cool to kind of like see what he's working on, but it's funny to be on the spectator side. Also, just like moving to such a different geographic location, it's like you don't have that community. Like you aren't. Not that I was an established artist in the Bay, but it was like I knew a lot of people, and through working at Max's, it was like I'd help people and like see, you could go to events and that sort of thing. So it's funny to be like, uh, I don't even know if I'm a small fish in a big pond. I'm like a tadpole or something like that now. Like I'm like barely even crossing the border of fish. But one other part that's kind of interesting is like when I was in the Bay Area, like one cool thing about making t-shirts and printing on textiles as opposed to like fine art prints is like I see um I see friends like even on like Instagram stories and that sort of thing. Like just yesterday I saw friends wearing a shirt that I'd made during the pandemic where I was like, oh, I forgot about that one. So it's funny that like even though I leave, I still get um some connection through social media. But really what was interesting is like when I would see my work out in on the street, like old t-shirts and stuff, like I made some shirts for friends like skate company, and I saw like a 12-year-old kid at the bus stop wearing one, and I was like, wow, that's kind of funny. But I was
Oh,
like, oh, like I know where you got that. You bought it at the skate shop, that sort of thing. I saw a bunch of like high school kids on like the track team running through Berkeley one time, and I was going to get some food, and I like was talking to this girl, and I was like, did you buy that shirt at Coffee Conscious, like this coffee shop that I used to have a bunch of stuff at? And she was like, oh no, I was at a restaurant. And I was like, I printed it, I remember. And once she said it, I remembered exactly what pop-up
oh my
like I
God.
did it at and that sort of thing. It was just like that's funny. But the what's sort of like the most impactful time of seeing like something that printed out in the world is like um I went to a show, like a sort of like music event in the city, and it was in this crowded bar, and I saw this girl wearing a shirt that I had done print for hire work for Tomiko. And
Oh,
it was funny how that extra layer of separation really like made it more impactful, because like even if I didn't sell the person the shirt individually, like at a market or something, like face to face, if it was through like a coffee shop or a place like where I had some work, it's like, all right, like I know where you got that. But to have that extra layer of separation, I was like, yo, I like printed that shirt. And the girl's like, oh, cool. Like, what? I was like, no, you don't get it. Like, I put blood, sweat, and tears into that. And then the
Oh,
same graphic, there's been some reprints through a commercial shop I work with, and I was wearing the shirt, and because I have one as well. And the guy that runs the commercial shop is like, hey, I printed that. And I was like, no, you didn't. I printed it. So it's just funny that like the same imagery, like, you know, so many people can touch it, and like just the same graphic like had so much different impact whether someone else was wearing it or whether I was wearing it, and depending on who printed it, all that sort of stuff.
that's awesome. And that feels kind of like the reason we do what we do is like it's sort of less about making something and more about how that thing is like used and like loved and enjoyed by people like around the world theoretically eventually.
Yeah.
We only have a few minutes left, so I'm wondering if you I was gonna say if you could give advice to your younger self, but it feels like you have such like a natural, organic process of like learning things. Maybe you could give advice to like someone younger who isn't you, who like is either trying to get into printmaking or like find their artistic voice, or just someone who's trying to like not drown so much in the art making process.
Yeah, definitely. One thing with screen printing is it's like it's so expressive and easy to make stuff that I think that younger people, like especially in like high school kids, I think should make their own t-shirts. Like, so I wish I've done some youth art classes, but I wish there was a way to like really push that out to a lot of youth, because like kids love making their own clothes and drawing on it with sketchy Sharpies and stuff like that. And it's like there's a way to do it that's a little bit more gives you a better result, and is easier to sort of like scale if you want to make sure it's for you and all your friends, that sort of thing. I'd say for getting into screen printing, I was part of a studio and then tried to do the DIY thing at home and almost quit within my first year because it was so frustrating getting the exposures to work and that sort of thing. So just thinking about like, there's a lot of ways to do DIY, and you can like have someone else burn the screen, like go to a commercial shop, or like there's a great place called Anthem Screen Printing that's a supplier in
Mm.
the city. And so it's like you can just do the printing, but like thinking about what part you want to sort of bite off, that's like a really important thing, because it's like and I don't like that screen printing or like other types of printmaking, you need a lot of like equipment and gear. And so just like kind of reiterating that, like start small, like get a screen burned and like make some prints and a t-shirt, or like take a workshop or that sort of thing, and then like slowly add one step at a time, because that's like how your process can evolve naturally. But like the same thing applies to beginning as well.
Mm. That's really good advice. I think art can often seem less logical and just sort of like haphazard. But
Mm-hmm.
it's nice to be like, no, you can sort of like set up goals and structures so that it's not so overwhelming and that you can actually have, you know, a million shirts that you've made that are like out in the
Mm-hmm.
world. That's really exciting. And I'm also like really happy to hear that like you've done some classes for people and like you're trying to find ways to like advocate for more people getting into the arts. That's sort of like what I'm doing with the Free Art and Design School project, is like the internet is a wonderful tool. And the more stuff that's out there that people can access, the better. And I really appreciate being able to talk to you about sort of like your perspectives on these things, and your journey as an artist. Do you have any sort of like parting short words of wisdom on do?
um yeah, it's a good question. I think just like one quote, this is a little trite pulling quotes out for the final marks, but there's a quote, I think his name is Mario Benedetti, but it's talking about like um you're not supposed to lower the level of the art to the level of the public. You're
Mm,
supposed to raise the public to the level of the art. And so thinking about how to like maintain integrity as an artist and like still do what you like, but then especially if there's like more of a like a vending side of it, like just making sure that you're like making things that are cool and pushing yourself. And so that can come from like a technique basis. Um, and I guess the only other parting remark is like I said, I've seen shirts out in the wild, and I'm still waiting for the day when I see one in a thrift store. I don't know if I'll be like happy because like it's out in the world again and even a further circle of separation, or if I'll be like trying to track down the person that gave away the shirt, you know. So I think there's still more that the future holds in terms of screen printing on my end.
Well, that's really exciting. So thank you for being here, and I appreciate all the advice and wisdom.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.